Sweetheart of the Song Tra Bong, pages 83 through 110. Vietnam was full of strange stories, some improbable, some well beyond that. But the stories that will last forever are those that swirl back and forth across the border between trivia and bedlam, the mad and the mundane. This one keeps returning to me. I heard it from Rat Kiley, who swore up and down it was truth, although in the end, I'll admit, it doesn't amount to much of warranty. Among the men in Alpha Company, Rat had a reputation for exaggeration and overstatement, a compulsion to rev up the facts, and for most of us it was a normal procedure to discount 60 to 70% of anything he had to say. If Rat told you, for example, he'd slept with 4 girls one night, you could figure it was about a girl and a half. It wasn't a question of deceit, just the opposite. He wanted to heat up the truth, to make it burn so hot that you would feel exactly what he felt. For Rat Kiley, I think, facts were formed by sensation, not the other way around. And when you listened to one of his stories, you'd find yourself performing rapid calculations in your head, subtracting superlatives, figuring the square root of an absolute, and then multiplying by maybe. Still, with this particular story, Rat never backed down. He claimed to have witnessed the incident with his own eyes, and I remember how upset he became one morning when Mitchell Sanders challenged him on the basic premise. "It can't happen," Sanders said. "Nobody ships his honey over to Nam. It don't ring true. I mean, you just can't import your own personal poontang." Own personal lady. Rat shook his head. "I saw it, man. I was right there. This guy did it. His girlfriend? Straight on. It's a fact." Rat's voice squeaked a little. He paused and looked at his friends. "Listen. This guy sends her the money, flies her over, this cute blonde, just a kid, just barely out of high school. She shows up with a suitcase and one of those plastic cosmetic bags, comes right out to the boonies. I swear, man, she's got on culottes, white culottes, and this sexy pink sweater. There she is." I remember Mitchell Sanders folding his arms. He looked over at me for a second, not quite grinning, not saying a word, but I could read the amusement in his eyes. Rat saw it too. "No lie," he muttered. "Culottes." When he first arrived in country, before joining Alpha Company, Rat had been assigned to a small medical detachment up in the mountains of Chu Lai, near the village of Tra Bong, where, along with 8 other enlisted men, he ran an aid station that provided basic emergency and trauma care. Casualties were flown in by helicopter, stabilized, then shipped out to the hospitals in Chu Lai or Da Nang. It was gory work, Rat said, but predictable. Amputations mostly, legs and feet. The area was heavily mined, thick with bouncing betties and homemade booby traps. For a medic, though, it was ideal duty, and Rat counted himself lucky. There was plenty of cold beer, 3 hot meals a day, a tin roof over his head, no humping at all. No officers either. You could let your hair grow, he said. You didn't have to polish your boots or snap off salutes or put up with the usual rear echelon nonsense. The highest-ranking NCO was an E6 named Eddie Diamond, whose pleasures ran from dope to Darwin, and except for a rare field inspection, there was no such thing as military discipline. As Rat described it, the compound was situated at the top of a flat-crested hill, the northern outskirts of Tra Bong. At one end was a small dirt helipad. At the other end, in a rough semicircle, the mess hall and medical hooches overlooked a river called the Song Tra Bong. Surrounding the place were tangled rolls of concertina wire, with bunkers and reinforced firing positions at staggered intervals, and base security was provided by a mixed unit of RFs, PFs, and ARV-9 infantry, which is to say virtually no security at all. As soldiers, the ARV-9s were useless. The rough and puffs were outright dangerous. And yet even with decent troops, the place was clearly indefensible. To the north and west, the country rose up with thick walls of wilderness, triple canopied jungle. Mountains unfolding into higher mountains, ravines and gorges, and fast-moving rivers and waterfalls and exotic butterflies and steep cliffs and smoky little hamlets and great valleys of bamboo and elephant grass. Originally, in the 1960s, the place had been set up as a special forces outpost, and when Rat Kiley arrived nearly a decade later, A squad of 6 Green Berets still used the compound as a base of operations. The greenies were not social animals. Animals, Rat said, but far from social. They had their own hooch, and the edge of the perimeter fortified with sandbags and a metal fence, and except for the bare essentials they avoided contact with the medical detachment. Secretive and suspicious loners by nature, the 6 greenies would sometimes vanish for days at a time, or even weeks. Then late in the night they would just as magically reappear, moving like shadows through the moonlight, filing in silently from the dense rain, forest off to the west. Moonlight. Filing in silently from the dense rain forest off to the west. Among the medics there were jokes about this, but no one asked questions. While the outpost was isolated and vulnerable, Rat said, he always felt a curious sense of safety there. Not much ever happened. The place was never mortared, never taken under fire, and the war seemed to be somewhere far away. On occasion, when casualties came in, there were quick spurts of activity, but otherwise the days flowed by without incident, a smooth and peaceful time. Most mornings were spent on the volleyball court. In the heat of midday the men would head for the shade, lazing away from the long afternoons, and after sundown there were movies and card games and sometimes all-night drinking sessions. It was during one of those late nights that Eddie Drummond first brought up the tantalizing possibility. It was an offhand comment, a joke really. What they should do, Eddie said, was pull some bucks and bring a few mama-sans from Saigon, spice up things, and after a moment one of the men laughed and said, "Our own little E.M. club," and someone else said, "And yeah, we pay our dues, don't we?" It was nothing serious, just passing time, playing with possibilities, and so for a while they tossed the idea around how you could actually get away with it, no officers or anything, nobody to clamp down. Then they dropped the subject and moved on to cars and baseball. Later in the night, though, a young medic named Mark Fossey kept coming back to the subject. "Look, if you think about it," he said, "it's not that crazy. You could actually do it." "Do what?" Rat said. "You know, bring a girl. I mean, what's the problem?" Rat shrugged. "Nothing? A war?" "Well, see, that's the thing," Mark Fossey said. "No war here. You should really do it. A pair of solid brass balls, that's all you need." There was some laughter, and Eddie Diamond told him he'd best strap down manhood, but Fossey just frowned and looked at the ceiling for a while and then went off to write a letter. 6 weeks later his girlfriend showed up. The way Rat told it, she came in by helicopter along with the daily resupply shipment out of Chule. A tall, big-boned blonde. At best, Rat said, she was 17 years old, fresh out of Cleveland Senior High. She had long white legs and blue eyes and the complexion like strawberry ice cream. Very friendly, too. At the helipad that morning, Mark Fossey grinned and put his arm around her and said, "Guys, this is Mary Ann." The girl seemed tired and somewhat lost, but she smiled. There was a heavy silence. Eddie Diamond, the ranking NCO, made a small motion with his hand, and some of the others murmured a word or two. Then they watched Mark Fossey pick up her suitcase and lead her by the arm down to the hooches. For a long while the men were quiet. "That guy," somebody finally said. At an evening chow, Mark Fossey explained how he'd set it up. Expensive, he admitted, and the logistics were complicated, but it wasn't like going to the moon. Cleveland to Los Angeles, L.A. to Bangkok, Bangkok to Saigon. She'd hopped a C-130 up to Chulai and stayed overnight at the USO. The next morning hooked a ride west with the resupply chopper. "A cinch," Fossey said, and gazed down at his pretty girlfriend. "The thing is, you just gotta want it enough." Mary Ann Bell and Mark Fossey had been sweethearts since grammar school. From the 6th grade on, they had known for a fact that someday they would be married, and live in a fine gingerbread house near Lake Erie, and 3 healthy yellow-haired children, and grow old together, and no doubt die in each other's arms and be buried in the same walnut casket. That was the plan. They were very much in love, full of dreams, and in the ordinary flow of their lives the whole scenario might well have come true. On the first night they set up house in one of the bunkers along the perimeter, near the Special Forces hooch. and over the next 2 weeks they stuck together like a pair of high school studies. Almost disgusting, Rat said, the way they mooned over each other, always holding hands, always laughing over some private joke. All they needed, he said, were a couple of matching sweaters. But among the medics there was some envy. This was Vietnam, after all, and Mary Ann Bell was an attractive girl. Too wide in the shoulders, maybe, but she had terrific legs, a bubbly personality, a happy smile. The men genuinely liked her. On the volleyball court she wore cut-off blue jeans and a black swimsuit top, which the guys appreciated, and in the evenings she liked to dance to music from Rat's portable tape deck. There was a novelty to it. She was good for morale. At times she gave off a kind of come-get-me energy, coy and flirtatious, but apparently it never bothered Mark Fossey. In fact, he seemed to enjoy it, just grinning at her, because he was so much in love, and because it was a sort of show that a girl will sometimes put on for her boyfriend's entertainment and education. Though she was young, Rat said, Mary Ann Bell was no timid child. She was curious about things. During her first days in the country she liked to roam around the compound asking questions. What exactly was a trip flare? How did a claymore work? What was behind those scary green mountains to the west? Then she'd squint and listen carefully while somebody filled her in. She had a good, quick mind. She paid attention. Often, especially during the hot afternoons, she would spend time with the ARVNs out along the perimeter, picking up little phrases of Vietnamese, learning how to cook rice over a can of sterno, how to eat with her hands. The guys sometimes liked to kid her about it. Our own little native, they'd say, but Mary Ann would just smile and stick out her tongue. I'm here, she'd say. I might as well learn something. The war intrigued her, the land too, and the mystery. At the beginning of her second week she began pestering Mark Fossey to take her down to the village at the foot of the hill. In a quiet voice, very patiently, he tried to tell her that it was a bad idea, way too dangerous, but Mary Ann kept after him. She wanted to get her feel for how people lived, what the smells and customs were. It did not impress her that the V.C. owned the place. Listen, it can't be that bad, she said. They're human beings, aren't they, like everybody else? Fossey nodded. He loved her. And so in the morning, Rat Kiley and 2 other medics tagged along as security while Mark and Mary Ann strolled through the villa like a pair of tourists. If the girl was nervous, she didn't show it. She seemed comfortable and entirely at home. The hostile atmosphere did not seem to register. All morning Mary Ann chattered away about how quaint the place was, how she loved the thatched roofs and the naked children, and the wonderful simplicity of village life. A strange thing to watch, Rat said, this 17-year-old doll, in her damn culottes, perky and fresh-faced, like a cheerleader visiting the opposing team's locker room. Her pretty blue eyes seemed to glow. She couldn't get enough of it. On their way back up to the compound she stopped for a swim in the Song Tra Bong, stripping down to her underwear, showing off her legs, while Fossey tried to explain to her about things like ambushes and snipers and the stopping power of an AK-47. The guys, though, were impressed. A real tiger, said Eddie Diamond. D-cup, guts, trainer bra brains. She'll learn, somebody said. Eddie Diamond gave a solemn nod. That's the scary part, I promise you. This girl will most definitely learn. In parts, at least, it was a funny story, and yet to hear Rat tell it you'd almost think it was intended as a straight tragedy. He never smiled, not even at the crazy stuff. There was always a dark, far-off look in his eyes, a kind of sadness, as if he were troubled by something sliding beneath the story's surface. Whenever we laughed, I remembered, he'd sigh and wait it out. But the one thing he could not tolerate was disbelief. He'd get edgy if someone questioned one of the details. She wasn't dumb, he'd snap. I never said that. Young, that's all I said, like you and me, a girl. That's the only difference. And I'll tell you something, it didn't amount to jack. I mean, when we first got here, all of us, we were real young and innocent, full of romantic bullshit, but we learned pretty quick, and so did Mary Ann. Rat would peer down at his hands, silent and thoughtful, and after a moment his voice would flatten out. You don't believe it? He'd say. Fine with me. But you don't know human nature. You don't know Nam. Then he'd tell us to listen up. A good sharp mind, Rat said. True, she could be silly sometimes, but she picked up on things fast. At the end of the second week, when 4 casualties came in, Mary Ann wasn't afraid to get her hands bloody. At times, in fact, she seemed fascinated by it. Not the gore so much, but the adrenaline buzz that went with the job, that quick hot rush in your veins when the choppers settled down and you had to do things fast and right. No time for sorting through options, no thinking at all. You just stuck your hands in and started plugging up holes. She was quiet and steady. She didn't back off from the ugly cases. Over the next day or two, as more casualties trickled in, she learned how to clip an artery and pump up a plastic splint and shoot in morphine. In times of action, her face took on a sudden new composure, almost serene, the fuzzy blue eyes narrowing into a tight, intelligent focus. Mark Fosse would grin at this, and was proud, yes, but also amazed. A different person, it seemed, and he wasn't sure what to make of it. Other things, too. The way she quickly fell into the habits of the bush. No cosmetics, no fingernail filing. She stopped wearing jewelry, cut her hair short and wrapped it in a dark green bandana. Hygiene became a matter of small consequence. In her second week, Eddie Diamond taught her how to assemble an M16, how the various parts worked, and there it was, a natural progression to learning how to use the weapon. For hours at a time she plunked away at sea ration cans, a bit unsure of herself, but as it turned out she had a real knack for it. There was a new confidence in her voice, a new authority in the way she carried herself. In many ways she remained naive and immature, still a kid, but Cleveland Heights now seemed very far away. Once or twice, gently, Mark Fosse suggested that it might be time to think about heading home. But Mary Ann laughed and told him to forget it. "Everything I want," she said, "is right here." She stroked his arm and then kissed him. On one level things remained the same between them. They slept together, they held hands and made plans for after the war. But now there was a new imprecision in the way Mary Ann expressed her thoughts on certain subjects. Not necessarily 3 kids, she'd say. Not necessarily a house on Lake Erie. "Naturally we'll still get married," she'd tell him, "but it doesn't have to be right away. Maybe travel first, maybe live together. Just test it out, you know."